here today at the 2016 Canadian Science Policy Conference. And joining me today is Daryl Copeland, who's a Senior Fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and a Policy Fellow at the University of Montreal Centre for International Studies and Research. So Daryl, thank you so much for joining us.
Delighted to be here again, Connor.
Great to have you. So to start off, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about what you see are some of the primary challenges in implementing science diplomacy on the global stage.
Thanks for the question. I believe that at the moment, the supply of science diplomacy is inadequate to meet the demand, and that's created a performance gap. So if you're looking at issues like climate change, diminishing biodiversity, habitat destruction, species extinction, how do we manage the global commons, the Arctic, outer space, cyberspace, what about food and water security? What about environmental collapse? I mean, all of these issues have a major S&T component and are best treated by knowledge-based, technologically enabled problem solving, which happens to be the scientific technique, of course, for generating knowledge. So the need to combine the political agency of diplomacy, so that's your ability to get things done in a non-violent way, through dialogue, negotiation, compromise, with the tremendous knowledge base of science. Combine the two, science and diplomacy, to give you science diplomacy, and you then have an international policy tool which is ideally suited to treat those issues that we dealt with. So that by way of just setting up why it is that we must up our game in science diplomacy, and which brings me to what I call the Maleficent Seven. The Maleficent Seven, because they're rather malign points. These are the obstacles and constraints to addressing the performance gap that I spoke of. Just briefly, the first one is the operating environment has been profoundly transformed since the heydays of science diplomacy practice, which was interestingly during the Cold War. Today, with intensified globalization, the emergence of what I call a heteropolar world order, where the vectors of power and influence are characterized more by difference than similarity, and that's new. An atmosphere that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous makes for a very, very tough operating environment where navigation, any kind of navigation, is difficult. So the world in ceaseless transition is a difficult place in which to do the complex business of science diplomacy. So that's point one. Point two, science and diplomacy have each serious problems of image. Science tends to be seen as dense and impenetrable, not least by diplomats who probably couldn't wait to drop it in high school. Most of them, they think of the periodic table or endoplasmic reticulum, and they wanted to get away from that and study some nice history or literature or philosophy, whatever, political science. So the image of science as dense and impenetrable, and the image of diplomacy as associated with weakness, appeasement, caving into power, Chamberlain in Munich, dithering dandies hopelessly lost in a haze of irrelevance somewhere between protocol and alcohol. You put those two images together, and as two nouns, they don't sit very comfortably anyway, but add all the baggage that they've got in terms of their brand, and you find that there's a double whammy, which is that you say science diplomacy to anybody, and chances are, A, their eyes glaze over, and B, they'd rather talk about anything. Sports, Donald Trump, anything. So that's the second point, the image problem. The third point is that it's bad enough there's this image problem, but there's also a substance problem, a substantial problem. The substantial problem is that our diplomatic ecosystem, so that's foreign ministry, foreign service, and the diplomatic business model or diplomatic business practice, have not kept pace with these other changes in the operating environment. And It's too slow, it's too hierarchic, it's too conventional. I could go on and on about the many challenges, but let's just say that the diplomatic ecosystem, so the delivery mechanism for our science diplomacy, is in crisis. It's not working very well. So that's another challenge. Fourth point is that science and diplomacy are effectively two solitudes, floating worlds which rarely meet or intersect. And so there you find that scientists prefer to stay in the lab and talk to other scientists about their research findings. Diplomats tend to hang around with people that look, talk, and dress like them, often about what might be going on outside. They're in the bubble quite a bit, in the diplomatic bubble. So these floating worlds of the lab for the scientists and the chancery or the foreign ministry for the diplomats, they rarely come together. And you ask yourself, how many diplomats are scientists? How many scientists are diplomats? When diplomats and scientists meet, can they communicate very well? Answer is no. And even if they could communicate well, what would they talk about? Because they speak different languages. So in terms of culture, values, and orientation, science and diplomacy represent two solitudes, kind of effectively. Fifth point is, I think a lot of our current political leadership developed its thinking about international relations during the Cold War, and so that was sort of the previous historical era that we're in now. So they tend to have a binary worldview. They see everything in terms of black and white rather than gray. So it's very Manichaean, very binary, very absolute worldview. What I argue is that, in fact, what they should be having is a world view, a WHIRLED view, because globalization has put all of those old constructs into the blender. And so now we need a world view to make some sense of this much more complicated stage on which we're trying to do science and do diplomacy. So the first Cold War carryover is this binary worldview. The second is, how do you characterize the major challenges or the major threats? During the Cold War, you might remember there was the communist world and there was the free world. And the atlases, the great swaths of red and great swaths of blue. The threat was characterized as universal and undifferentiated, all that communist world that we used to see. It was all the same, and it was everywhere. That's the threat. Today, with the global war on terror, terrorists are considered to be all the same. Doesn't matter if it's the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad. They're just kind of all thrown in the same barrel. And so that threat as well is characterized as universal, which is it's everywhere, oh my God, and it's undifferentiated. They're all the same. So that's the second bit of Cold War psychological baggage that got carried over. And the third one is, how do you respond with a binary worldview and a characterization of a threat as universal and undifferentiated? Well, you militarize international policy. It was done during the Cold War with containment, deterrence, mutually assured destruction. It's being done today with the global war on terror, and how much more militarized can you be than that? You can't. So we're almost there. So Cold War carryover, psychological baggage, impeding our capacity to do science diplomacy because we've got an obsolete set of intellectual tools with which to engage our capacity to do science diplomacy. Point number 6 is that there's a serious resource misallocation in international policy envelopes right now, which is to say the lion's share of resources go to defense, diplomacy and development get starved. When that happens, you can't affect the outcomes of your efforts to do science diplomacy without the resources that you need to improve your results. You know, results and resources, they're very closely related. At the moment, most of the resources go to defense, go to the military. What's the problem with that? There are no military solutions to most of these S&T driven problems. You can't call in an airstrike on a warming climate. You can't garrison against pandemic disease, you can't send out an expeditionary force to occupy the alternatives to a carbon economy. I mean, there's a exquisite disconnect right now. We're putting all of our resource into the military, or most, when in fact what we need is to get our diplomacy and our development and our science diplomacy, which combines both of those together, and we're not. Last point. Because of 1 to 6, our institutional capacity, our skill inventory, our ability to manage these issues is undermined by virtue of the fact that foreign ministries and international organizations don't have the wherewithal to construct their science diplomacy in an effective way. So that's the Maleficent 7. Those are the major obstacles and constraints, as I see them, to the practice of science diplomacy. And if we're going to up our game and close that performance gap, we will have to address each of those issues.
Absolutely. So I wonder if we could just quickly touch on this. We were chatting about it before the interview. How do you think the science policy landscape has changed in the wake of the elephant in the room of the Canadian Science Policy Conference taking place this November 9th, 2016, one day after the American election?
It's rocked my world. And what it will mean in terms of the more specific issues that we're talking about at the conference, I think remains to be seen. Let's put it this way. This is not someone for whom evidence-based, data-informed decision-making model is going to have much traction. I mean, just listen to what he actually said during the campaign. But what will that mean for the rather particularistic issues that our panels are addressing? I'm not sure, but here's what I've been thinking about. I've been thinking about what does the election of someone who has said what he said during the campaign, what does that say about rationality? What does that say about democratic process? What does that say about evidence-based decision-making? Because a lot of people seem to have ignored the evidence and made the decision to vote for Mr. Trump. And to me, that's next to impossible to explain. So I'm miffed. I'm worried, and I'm uncertain about where we may be all headed in the wake of this development.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Daryl.
Pleasure. Look forward to the next time, Connor.
Excellent. Me as well.
Cheers.
Thanks very much.